Well, I think Lily and I have talked about this many times, and just the way we define our dual identities, or really, I think my identities are multiple. I have multiple identities. It's not just a dual identity. I think the most obvious identities that I embody or that I relate to is obviously being Taiwanese and also American. So this concept of being both Taiwanese and American, Taiwanese American, is essentially how I would describe my identity. Although I think for me, being Taiwanese American is not just a hyphenated identity, but also identities that are separate and distinct on their own. So I'm both Taiwanese and American.
Well, I think I would not disagree with that. I think what Rosie said makes sense. I would define my identity slightly differently, I believe. I think it's more difficult in my opinion, for at least in my identification, to differentiate between what is Taiwanese and what is American in my identity. So although they're both distinct identities, they're also one together to the Taiwanese American identity. However, I think my Taiwanese American identity is probably different from another Taiwanese American who would also identify being hyphenated American. I think we would probably identify it differently because I think the content of what is Taiwanese American for me is unique. There's a lot of Taiwanese in it, and there's also a lot of American in it, and it has been fused together over the years.
Well, I think that's a good question. When do I decide which identity I am? I think when I'm in the United States context, I feel very American. I identify with being. I often say that I don't necessarily feel Asian American. I definitely feel. I'm definitely aware that I am not your typical, white bread American, but I don't necessarily feel Asian American. I identify with a lot of different Asian American political issues, but when I'm among Asian Americans, I feel Taiwanese. And when I am in Taiwan, I feel very Taiwanese. Obviously, I do feel American when I'm in Taiwan because I think when I'm for example, as an academic, I do interview a lot of Taiwanese, or I speak to Taiwanese to find out what's the pulse of Taiwanese in Taiwan. And when I'm in Asia, I definitely feel like sometimes I'm in a third-person perspective when I'm speaking to Asians. In that sense, that's when my Americanness come in. But at the same time, I think it's so easy for me because it is so easy for me to understand what it's like to be Asian in Asia or to be Taiwanese in Taiwan, that it is very easy for me to just kind of get into this Taiwanese-ness when I'm in Taiwan. So it's this kind of interesting dualness that I feel all the time.
Well, I guess for me, I think my identity is more integrated, perhaps, or maybe we're perhaps even speaking of the same thing, but just defining it differently. I tend to think that I am both Taiwanese and American, regardless whether I'm in America or in Taiwan. So the two never leaves me. The two, I guess that's how you could. That's how I would define. Would identify myself, is that I'm both Taiwanese and American at the same time all the time.
Well, I think maybe I need to explain myself a little better. I think when I say that I feel distinctively Taiwanese or distinctively American, I think I do say that because when I'm in the United States, even though I'm hanging out with, my American friends, whether they're Asian American or other Americans, sometimes it's easy for me to just kind of be still a third person and looking in. Oftentimes, no matter where I am, I feel like I'm looking in. I'm the third party when I'm in Taiwan or in the United States.
Well, I guess I would agree, and as the third party, I am Taiwanese American. I'm not Taiwanese or American, but I'm Taiwanese American. So that's my vantage point as a third person, and I think that's quite an advantageous place to be. It's interesting to be able to stand apart a little bit, whether I'm looking at domestic politics in America or U.S. foreign policy, or I am a third party looking at what's happening in Taiwan today. I really enjoyed that third party vantage point.
What I think, especially for me, I think I do see it also as an advantage to be a third party. Whether it's a third party as a Taiwanese or a third party as an American or a Taiwanese American, it is an advantage, especially because I'm in academia. And I think, not that I believe that academics are objective. I think none of us are truly neutral. I think as academics, we could be successful as academics when we give an objective analysis, but ultimately we all come in with some sort of ideological viewpoint or certain peer dynamic convictions. But at the same time, being this advantage or vantage point as a third party allows us to see the global picture, the bigger picture that sometimes when we are so involved as a main party within conversations or as a main party within conflicts, we often miss. But as a third party, I'm allowed, I'm experiencing what's going on with a totally different vantage point that I feel like have definitely allowed me to see things more clearly and to understand the political situations, the geopolitical situations that I do have to analyze and understand as an academic. Well, I think one way I would be able to, I think one analogy I would make would be as looking at, for example, the post 9/11 situation in the United States. I think, my experiences of observing a lot of my American friends or people who are my peers, my colleagues, my friends, even though I do feel American, I think being in a third-party perspective allowed me to see the different positions that different political parties in our country, the United States, took post 9/11, and the different policies that the Bush administration had adhered to and had become to adopted and then implemented. In a perspective, in a way that I feel like, not that it made me more objective or more neutral, but I think it allowed me to see the global picture and allowed me to see how the world would view the United States post 9/11. And I think that would be my analogy that I would use to also then talk about how I view what's going on geopolitically in the Asia Pacific region, whether it's in Taiwan, China, Japan, or South Korea, or North Korea. I think it allows me to see the global picture and how the world view the Taiwan-China situation, or the North Korea situation that's ongoing right now as we speak.
Well, I think for me, with respect to looking at Taiwan as a third person or third party, I think it's quite interesting. Even just today, I was reading some headlines on Taipei Times website and reading different stories, and over time I've read stories on the website and observed Taiwanese politics. And it's interesting how if you capture history in this one moment in time, it's quite interesting how, well, if you capture history this one moment in time, it is very difficult to try to figure out why is it that there's so much contention, and why is it that the different camps, blue camp or green camp, why can they not agree that they both have Taiwan's best interests in mind? But I think as a third party, what I could do, or what I could provide perhaps, is maybe a historical perspective. When you're caught right in this moment in time, this moment in history, you could very well forget the larger perspective, the greater context, and I think that's what, as a third person looking in, that's what I see. I see that there's a lot of mistrust, and there, for sure, is basis for mistrust. That perhaps the people on the sovereignty, independent side versus those on the side of the blue camp. I think there's a lot of mistrust because there's a history that has led to this mistrust, which I think oftentimes when you're right at this moment in time, you don't take into account.
I do think that as a third party also, what we could do is, I do think that it is important to kind of gauge what's happening in different snapshots in history and to understand moments in time. I think the structure of history is very important, and we need to acknowledge the structure of history, but it is also very important to look at and to understand what's happening at any given moments in time. And I agree with Lily that having a historical perspective allows us to understand these different moments in time better. But at the same time, I also believe that as a third party, we are also given the privilege of gauging and understanding these moments in time and to see some truth in these moments in time, whereas people who are not third parties might be so involved in these snapshots or moments in time that they not only cannot see the historical perspective, but they're blurred in their perspective of what's happening at any given moment as well. And for example, I think a lot of people who are in Taiwan today, they are experiencing, the evolution, the emergence of Taiwanese national identity. And as you're immersed in this type of, all these transformations are happening, sometimes it's very difficult to step back and to really understand what's happening. And I think as third parties, we could do that. I mean, as a third party, I could truly see for myself that there is an emergence of a national Taiwanese identity that all of us should acknowledge, the world over should acknowledge. Not only Taiwanese people should acknowledge, but the different identities, the different hyphenated identities, Taiwanese Chinese, Chinese Taiwanese, Chinese, indigenous Taiwanese, all these different identities within Taiwan sometimes fail to acknowledge. But as third parties, we could see that truly these different identities are merging into a national identity. And I think that's something that we as third parties have the privilege of seeing and understanding. I think I see elections as moments in history where the population, each individual is coming in with different histories and different life experiences, have an opportunity to express self-determination, to determine for themselves what they want the future of their lives, including the future of their country, to look like.
Sure, and I think that I wouldn't necessarily say that one election will signify a whole revolution of identity. I think it has been years in making, especially since the lift of martial law in 1987. So this was the third free election. So every snapshot, every moment in history were markers for this revolutionization of identity.
I think, that's why I mentioned earlier the emergence of national identity, the evolution of national identity, because I think I agree with Lily that every step along the way, this path dependency along the way has paved the way for the critical juncture that we do see in this most recent election, the critical juncture that is in the evolution of Taiwanese national identity. And also, to some extent, the consolidation of Taiwanese democracy. The fact that even though the election itself was a very contested one, Taiwan's democracy survived and has been pretty much intact in the last couple months is I think, a great reflection of the consolidation of democracy in Taiwan.
And it's interesting too if you look at the three different elections. Starting from the first free election, I think it was 1996, was it? And how so much has changed since then. At that time, there was a transition of the head of government from the old regime to the new regime. But however, the structure within all the different parts within the government did not change. There was not the transformation to the local level. But if you look at it today, there has been so much transformation from the central government all the way down to localities, and I find that very interesting, and that really shows you the evolution of democracy, evolution of a transformation of identity.
And I think transitions take time, especially given the institutionalization of the KMT prior to the lift of martial law, the dense, very entrenched institutionalization of the KMT made it very difficult for the transition to be momentous, or to make it very difficult for the transition to occur instantly. I think it required time, and I think that the last 10 to 15 years have been the critical time for Taiwan to change and transform, and that's why it's a transition, and that's why democratic transitions are. It's not something that could happen overnight.
And if you just look at education reform in particular in Taiwan, there is a new generation of Taiwanese kids who identify fully with Taiwan and who perhaps now know more about Taiwan than their parents know about Taiwan in terms of local histories, local cultures, local languages. And that, of course, did not take time. Did not happen overnight. You don't just change the textbooks overnight. There was definitely, I think, deliberation, a lot of deliberation and change in policy for that to happen, where now different mother tongues, Hakka and Holo, are taught at local schools. That was never the case before. I think it was only even just up to the early 80s or late 70s when the government limited how many Taiwanese language shows could be on TV, could be shown on TV per night.
I was just going to say that I think it's particularly interesting that what we're seeing in terms of these evolution of identities, it's not just among the native Taiwanese who thought of themselves as Chinese in the past. I think it's also among the second or third generation of mainlanders, or the so-called mainlanders, who are now define themselves as new Taiwanese. People who might have ethnic Chinese identifications and ethnic Chinese roots and histories, who now also embrace the national Taiwanese identity. And I think that in itself is a tribute to the democratization that has occurred in Taiwan and the educational reforms that Lily has mentioned just now, and also just the embrace of Taiwanese cultures. And what is essentially ethnic Chinese is also now becoming merged with other Taiwanese identities to become something uniquely Taiwanese.
And I think what's interesting is that it may no longer be as interesting to talk about Taiwanese American identities, but it's more interesting to talk about what it means to be Taiwanese, Chinese, Holo, Hakka, Sierraya, Taiwanese in Taiwan. I think that would really be the interesting discussion.
The reason that I would connect, or I would say that there's some sort of relationship, I don't know if it's a causal relationship, but the reason I would say that there's some sort of relationship between democratization and the emergence of this unique Taiwanese national identity is because democratization allowed freedoms of expression. It allowed different people who might in the past not have, exercised their human agency to identify with specific identities, have now feel like they have the freedom to say, hey, this is what I identify with. And also democratization has allowed education reforms to occur. So, for the first time in, decades, the education system in Taiwan has now, in addition to understanding Chinese history and Taiwan within 5,000 years of Chinese history, there's also exposure to Taiwanese history, Taiwanese culture, the uniqueness of Taiwan in the geopolitical position, within the geography of the Asia Pacific. This exposure has allowed people to identify for themselves, to self-determine for themselves what they wanted to identify with in the past. So that to me is one of the fruits of democracy. And that's why I would say that I would go as far as to say that there is a relationship between the emergence of unique Taiwanese national identity and democratization.
I definitely think so. I think there is both new information, additional information that was hidden before. People are now able to speak freely, so the more information are disseminated, and also more access to information. And when I say information, I'm really talking about cultural information of who you are, where you come from. And I think with that, it only came about through democratization on Taiwan.
And I also think democratization allowed people to, allowed a lot of people for the very first time to face the truth of what Taiwan is, which is a de facto independent country within the Asia Pacific, a country that has had its own government. It has had a separate history from mainland China for for at least a century, if not more. Prior to 1895, when the Japanese colonial government came to Taiwan, Taiwan itself was in the periphery of the Qing dynasty, of the periphery of the Chinese Empire. So even prior to 1895, even prior to Japanese colonialism, Taiwan itself was a separate, distinct entity. Although, obviously there were interactions between the the Qing dynastic court and the Han Chinese settlers in Taiwan, it's been over a century since Taiwan has had real direct control from the mainland. And so democracy itself allows that kind of information to be disseminated among the population. Instead of having to buy into only one version of history, whether it's the Japanese version of history or the Kuomintang nationalist Chinese version of history, now Taiwanese people are given the privilege to understand Taiwan as it really is. This distinct entity, this distinct island nation that has been really de facto independent from mainland China for hundreds of years. Can someone call themselves Taiwanese, did you say?
Yeah, and or is that more new Taiwanese or?
What I mean by new Taiwanese is essentially Taiwanese. I think that new Taiwanese also apply to people who are native Taiwanese. And the reason it's new Taiwanese is because this new Taiwanese identity is one embraced by everyone. And it's new from what was before. What was before was this identity of oppression, right? It was a vis-a-vis identity. It was Taiwanese vis-a-vis the mainlanders, the whites and then. But now, this new Taiwanese identity actually embodies or incorporates everyone. Everyone together, and all the people in the island nation of Taiwan is a new Taiwanese.
Sure, and I think anyone who identifies with the island of Taiwan and with what's happening in Taiwan today, with its cultures, its arts, its contribution in science and health to the world. I mean, anyone who identifies with Taiwan could very well call themselves Taiwanese. I mean, it's a democracy where people can make these statements about their identity.
And again, I would go back to my third person observations. I think in my observations of the second or third generation mainlander descendants, I see that a lot of them, because, as I mentioned before, because of democratization, are beginning to really see for themselves that they do identify with Taiwan. And why not? They are born and raised in Taiwan. They have contributed to the economic and political developments within Taiwan.
Sure.
And just like as Americans, we are proud to contribute to the economic development of the United States. Being an academic, I'm very proud to be part of the education system within the United States. These new Taiwanese, also should have every reason to be very proud in their contributions in all the different fields that Lily had mentioned already.
And I think what's interesting is that it's very important, perhaps, in speaking about identity with these Pan Blue supporters, that as this first, second, third generation Taiwanese, being Taiwanese does not mean that you have to disregard your Chinese identity or your Chinese history, your Chinese ties. Just as me being Taiwanese American does not mean that I'm just American, I'm no longer Taiwanese. I think in a democracy, the beauty of it is that I could fully embrace my American identity as well, fully embrace my Taiwanese identity. And I think a first, second, third generation Chinese Taiwanese or Taiwanese Chinese, however you want to identify yourself, could very well embrace what is Taiwanese in them and what is Chinese in them.
And I also think this is a good time then to differentiate between ethnic identity and national identity.
Sure.
I think, again, I would make the analogy with the United States. For example, as an ethnic person in the United States, I am a Taiwanese ethnic, but as my national identity is an American national identity. So I see that as happening, I see that as a good explanation of what could be happening in Taiwan today too, which is you could be ethnic Chinese, ethnic Han Chinese, or ethnic indigenous Taiwanese, and at the same time embrace the Taiwanese national identity. And it's not just a Taiwan thing. We see that the world over.
Sure, it's definitely not a new concept. I mean, if you were just to look at Southeast Asia, there are many examples in Southeast Asia. For example, in Malaysia, it's a multicultural, multi-ethnic nation with Chinese, Indians, and indigenous Malay living together, and they're nationally Malaysian, but they're ethnically Chinese or ethnically Malay.
And I think another good example would be Singapore. There are a lot of different ethnicities within Singapore, but together they're Singaporean. Or we could draw from European experiences. You know, if we look at Belgium, for example, these people are Belgium nationals, but a lot of them are ethnic Germans or ethnic French.
Switzerland, for
And
another example.
a lot of these Europeans also speak multiple languages but at the same time identify with different distinct European identities. Within the Blue Camp, I do think that is true within the Blue Camp, that there are more and more people who are taking steps towards embracing the Taiwan identity. But I think the major difference I would say that still exists, and I don't know if would be that a lot of them are embracing the Taiwanese identity as a local identity. So again, what I was talking about before, this national identity may not have adhered yet. They see Taiwan as the local identity that they identify with. That's to some extent not all that different from seeing Taiwan as another province of China.
If you're Cantonese, but you identify with being Cantonese because you live in the Canton province.
But I do believe that younger generations of Blue Camp, people within the Blue Camp, are beginning to definitely identify with Taiwan, but whether it's a local identity that they identify with or a national identity, I think only time will tell. These are things that are still under observation, and also people are living these experiences right now.
And I think over time people will come to see for themselves, with full evidence, and they gather their own data, that Taiwan indeed is a distinct, separate nation from their neighbors, China, Japan, Korea.
Well, I think even within the Blue Camp, there's varieties of identities.
Sure.
I think that's something I would definitely say. I don't think there's a consensus within the Blue Camp. I think there might be a generational divide, and also maybe an experience divide as well. What I do more clearly see, or the overarching identity that I do see within the Blue Camp, despite the varieties of identities that do exist, would be this idea of looking at Taiwan as a local area or a local identity, embracing Taiwan as their birthplace, their hometown, an area where they've much of their life experiences have developed in, but seeing Taiwan within the greater context of still this idea of the greater China. I think that even that itself is evolving a lot. I think even that identity itself is evolving a lot. I think this idea of locality or local identity is evolving, but whether it's reached a national identification, I am definitely skeptical of that.
Yeah, and I think, as I was saying earlier, that perhaps over time people will come to observe and gather their own data points and evidence that Taiwan is indeed a distinct, separate national entity from their neighbors, of course, China, Japan, and Korea, and only time will tell right now. And I think there's definitely a lot of rhetoric on the Pan Blue side, trying to argue that Taiwan is a local identity rather than a national identity. Would you say?
Right. I think the dominating voice within the Blue Camp would argue that Taiwan is a local identity rather than a national identity. But like I said before, I think there's disparate voices even within the Blue Camp, and I think that's one of the main reasons why, even though the Blue Camp has been successful politically, I think it hasn't been entirely successful, or the Green Camp has made a lot of headway since the lift of martial law and since Taiwan's democratic transition. I think a lot of it has to do with the disparate voices that are coming out of the Blue Camp.
And I think I'm hopeful in general, because I think there has been reforms in education, and education is really an engine of propaganda, if you think about it, whether it's for an authoritarian government or even for a democratic government. It's a place where the next generation are learning about what it means to be Taiwanese, what it means to be American, what it means to be Malaysian,
and I think,
or European, of course.
Right. And I also think that to some extent, I would, as a third-party observer, again, I would maybe characterize what's happening in the Blue Camp as an identity crisis of some sort. I think within the Green Camp, there are a lot of status quo people. There are a lot of people who support sovereignty. They're staunch independence supporters. But I think overall, there's still this identification of Taiwan.
Sure.
Whereas within the blue camp, there's definitely an identity crisis right now.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to decipher a dominating voice within the group, the blue camp. And I think that's definitely something that we need to, as third parties,
Sure.
watch in the years to come. Yeah, I definitely think that to some extent it is political ideology. I think the mere fact that though that they're beginning to embrace Taiwan is also again a byproduct of democratization. I think before Taiwan was China. You know, that was how the KMT education taught everyone that Taiwan is China. But the mere fact that there is a local identity that they're beginning to embrace is a byproduct of democratization, and it is a step forward. I do see that only time will tell, but I think that I do believe that this local identification will evolve to a national identification over time. And also one thing I do want to stress is that I think, and this is, you know, something that I would advise, you know, all people in Taiwan, whether they're Taiwanese, Chinese, Taiwanese Chinese, or Chinese Taiwanese, is that I think Taiwanese people need to begin to see Taiwan as a global, Taiwan itself as a global nation, as a global citizen within the international sphere, needs to see Taiwan not just vis-a-vis China, but see Taiwan vis-a-vis other countries within the Asia Pacific, and also see Taiwan as a country vis-a-vis the world, and not to see Taiwan as just this confined space, not just to see Taiwan within this confined space of Taiwan, China.